tal? ¿Cómo están? Buenos días a todos. Hoy vamos a hablar sobre Borgoña. Es un nuevo año. Estamos empezando con pie derecho en The Wine Club y vamos a hablar con un gran Master of Wine muy reconocido en el mundo del vino que se llama Atkin. Así es que vamos a ver qué más seguimos creando y aprendiendo acerca del mundo del vino. So, let's start, my friend, if you don't mind. Let's start with from the beginning, because probably not all the people know you. Most of them, yes, but probably not about your trajectory. So could you please tell us a little bit about your trajectory? How do you start? I mean, how do you become as a master of wine and in this business?
I started as a journalist. I studied French at university, and I wasn't sure what to do with my life afterwards. I wanted to find a job that would feel like being a student for the rest of my life. So I decided to become a journalist. And I got a job on a wine magazine called Wine and Spirit, which doesn't exist anymore, like many magazines. And that was in 1985. So I've been doing this for, how long is that, 35 years? Help. And I became a Master of Wine in 2001. So it was the Master of Wine came later, really. I'd already been doing wine for 15, 16 years when I did the Master of Wine. But it was luck, really, that I wanted to be a journalist, and I just happened to get a job on a magazine that was specialized in wine and spirits, although I was not very interested in spirits. So it was the wine that appealed to me.
Wow, it's a long time.
It's a very long time. That's when you say you're much older than, no, you're much younger than you look.
I mean,
or you look much younger than you are. Anyway, something like that. That's what you need to say, right? That was your cue, Mark, to say, God, it's amazing that you're 59 and how young you look. There we go. But no, there we go. Yes, a long time.
Yeah, it's
and big changes. You know, I've seen. I mean, I'm seeing my friend Andres Rosberg is there. Hi, Andres. Good to see you. Amazing changes in the world of wine. 1985 was the beginning, really, of the boom of New World wines in Europe, particularly Australia, really. And I think Australia helped to launch a lot of what's happened subsequently with the New World. So yeah, it was a good time to start.
Yeah. So the first time that I know about you, it was when I was working in Vinoteca a long time ago in 2007, and I was reading the guide that you made about Burgundy wines. Okay. So I was impressed about the kind of information that you have in your mind, all the wines that you have in mind. And to start with the history, can you tell us a little bit about the most important aspects in history of Burgundy that influence the wines nowadays?
Okay, I think there are three things. One is historical, if you like, and the other are more recent things. The historic thing was the monks, really, and particularly the Cistercian monks, but also the Benedictine monks were the people who first mapped the vineyards of Burgundy, and they selected really the best sites, particularly as being in the middle of the slope in the Côte d'Or, and those were the sites where historically the snow melted first in the winter, so they were the warmest sites. Okay, funny when you think about what's happening now, not that funny, but I think the Burgundian monks understood the whole idea of terroir, i.e. that different parcels, different places gave you different flavors in the wine if they were filtered, if you like, through a grape variety, and the grape variety is obviously Pinot Noir for reds and Chardonnay for whites. The two other things that I think are significant in Burgundy now, one is, three things you could say. One is the start of domain bottling, which really began after the Second World War. It's very easy to remember that historically Burgundy was a very poor region, and domain bottling and the growth in domain bottling, in other words, of growers with vineyards, rather than selling the grapes or making wine and selling them to a négociant, making their own wines, was really something that started after the Second World War in Europe in 1945, but really didn't get going until the 1960s and the early 70s. That would be the second thing. The two more recent things, one is the use of selection tables, so mesas de selección, that you use. You don't just put all of the grapes into the vat, you take out the best, if you like, or rather you remove the worst and keep the best. And those weren't really introduced in Burgundy until the 1990s. It's amazing. Less than 30 years, people have been using selection tables. And part of the reason for that was that Burgundy, as I said, was very poor. And in the past, people used to put everything into the vat because they needed to. The fourth thing, and I think this is historic, but also much more important now, is climate change. And if you look, I mean, it's funny, if you look at the records, until 2003, one of the hottest vintages ever in Burgundy was in 1540. If you read the descriptions of 1540, they said mass 8 times to pray for rain. Okay, so hot vintages are not new in Burgundy, but what we're seeing now, 2017, 18, 19, 20, yeah, the world is getting hotter. Burgundy is getting hotter. Burgundy is a marginal climate where Pinot Noir needs cloud cover. It needs coolness to show at its best. And I think that's a very, very significant change. And I think, you know, the last 20 years, I'd have said climate change was a good thing, that vintages are earlier, so they don't come after the autumn equinox, that they tend to be, you know, they're sunnier, they're warmer, they're less wet. And all the bad vintages in Burgundy tended to be wet vintages. Now we've had a run of hot vintages in a row, and I'm not convinced that it's altogether a good thing. If you have a Grand Cru Burgundy like an Echezeaux or a Bonmar being picked at 16.5% alcohol, in other words, more alcoholic than a Vino de Jerez, yeah, a Manzanillo or something, there's something very wrong. So I think those 4 things, monks, domain bottling, the use of mesas de selección and climate change are the 4 things that are central, I would say, if you like, to the way Burgundy is today.
Wow.
Sorry, very long answer.
Yeah, as probably many people in this meeting room knows, one of the things that we always speak about Burgundy is about terroir. So in your opinion, how can you define the terroir? What can you tell us about the terroir of Burgundy?
Well, the 2 things I'd say about terroir. One is that terroir is not exclusively French. It's a French word, but in English we say, you know, a sense of place. In Spanish, I don't know what you say, you know, I'm not sure what you say, terruño, I suppose, you know.
Yeah.
Terruño, but terruño is sort of a translation of terroir in a way. Yeah. And all it means is that certain places make different styles of wine. And if you look at, you know, Chile, which is, and obviously where Pedro Parra comes from, and he's just published a book about terroir. Chile has terroir, Argentina has terroir, Mexico has terroir, everywhere has terroir, right? That's important to remember. It's also important to remember that Burgundy has good terroir and it has bad terroir, right? And historically, the best terroir, mostly speaking, were the Grand Cru, then the Premier Cru, then the village level, then the so-called generic level wines. But I think what's happened now with climate change is that this has been turned on its head. In the areas that were considered too cold or too wet or too high in the past are now looking more interesting. So I think that terroir, if you like, at the moment, it's still very relevant in Burgundy. And if, you know, anybody who tastes a wine, I don't know, from Echezeaux and tastes it against one from La Tâche, and they're very close to each other, obviously they're a few hundred yards, they're obviously very different, right? And obviously winemaking is part of that too. And I think that the human intervention in terroir is often underplayed. People think terroir is just climate and particularly soil, but it's lots of things, including the human element, if you like. But I think the terroir at the moment, don't get too obsessed about it, because I think also you can have a good terroir and you can make very bad wine from it, right? Similarly, it's very difficult to make great wine from a bad terroir, but you can certainly make bad wine from a good terroir, okay? So I think that terroir is important, but never forget that somebody has to make the wine. Somebody has to take the grapes and make crucial decisions like, you know, when do you pick? How long do you macerate for? What type of oak do you use? When do you bottle it? Do you use sulfur? Do you use whole bunches? All of these things influence the style of a wine. So terroir is important, but it's not the only thing. And my earlier point I said was I think that terroir is changing because historically the best terroir were the hottest and the driest places in Burgundy. That's no longer true, I would say. And I think that within the next 20 years, even 25 years, we A, may not see Pinot Noir as the dominant grape in Burgundy anymore, and B, we may see a complete revolution in the concept of where the best vineyards are located.
Wow. So talking about the regions and sub-regions, I have in mind a question that I want to know your opinion about the Chardonnay. Chablis, actually I have a Chablis with me
Good for
from the,
you.
yeah, I would try it today. It's in Mexico, we don't have too many brands, but many are coming. And in your opinion, what's the main difference between Chardonnay from Chablis and for Côte de Bon? In
Okay,
that,
well, I mean, white grapes, i.e., and the main white grape in Burgundy is obviously Chardonnay, although you can find some Aligoté and even a little bit of Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc. But it's white grapes are grown in all of the 5 regions of Burgundy. Way less so in the Côte de Nuit. There's very little. There's not much white wine made really in the Côte de Nuit. A little bit. As you mentioned very rightly, the main areas would be Chablis and the Côte de Beaune, which is where the majority of the most famous white wine vineyards are located, and then the Côte Chalonnaise, and then the Mâconnais. And the Mâconnais is by far the biggest white wine area. I mean, it's even bigger than Chablis in terms of area for Chardonnay. Lots and lots of Chardonnay produced there. But I think the two, you rightly said, the two most interesting areas are Chablis and the Côte de Beaune. And it's interesting to contrast the two because Chablis is actually closer to Sancerre than it is to Beaune, right? And people often think about Chablis as being part of Burgundy, and obviously it is. But in some ways, it's almost closer to the Loire stylistically and closer to Champagne, to the unsparkling, the still wines of Champagne. And that's very important to remember. And so Chablis is very unlike any other white wine in Burgundy. It's much higher in acidity. It has these classic chalky limestone soils, these famous Kimmeridgian limestone soils, and those also give a character to the wine that this part of Burgundy was underwater historically. And that's why you can still walk through the vineyards and find fossils. You know, you can find things that were on the seabed historically, millions of years ago. So, and I think that influences the style. It's cooler, it's further north. As I said, stylistically, obviously it's made from a different grape, Chardonnay as opposed to Sauvignon Blanc, but it's almost closer to Sancerre. And it's no accident that Saint-Brie, which is an outlying area of Chablis, just next to Chablis, is made from Sauvignon Blanc. So I think that it almost makes sense to think of Chablis as being not like a cross between Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, but something closer to Sauvignon Blanc in terms of its acidity. It often is unoaked. It's a very different style, refreshing, great value. You've got one there. Ages really well because it's actually high in natural acidity most of the time, and is often unoaked. The Côte de Beaune, which is where the main bits of the main vineyards, the most famous white wine vineyards are based, particularly in Grand Cru La Corton Charlemagne, and then all of the Grand Cru of Puy-Marché and Chassagne-Montrachet. Meursault doesn't have any Grand Cru, but it could do. It just didn't apply for any historically. These tend to be richer styles, right? And they're more powerful styles. We're further south. Remember, you've driven a couple of hours in your car, probably slightly more. So it's a warmer area, the Côte de Beaune, and it tends to make richer wines. Meursault would be the richest of the lot. I think Puligny would be the most Chablis-like. It's often the highest in acidity of that group. And Chassagne historically grew more red grapes than white. So Chassagne is an area which is warmer again. I mean, not all of the vineyards, depends how high up the slope you go. But that area too produces. Remember, it's a red wine area as well as a white wine area, and tends to produce these quite riper styles. Chassagne is further south, and it's close to the Côte Chalonnaise. So very nearby. So I think that if you look at the Côte de Beaune, you look at Chablis, they're almost the two poles of the highest level of Chardonnay in Burgundy. The Mâconnais, Puy-Fissé, which is famous, and some of the vineyards in the Côte Chalonnaise, particularly, I think Rouy is really good, and bits of Montagny make good white wines too. But those famous ones come from those two very contrasting areas.
Oh, and talking about the other part of the wines, that it's a red wine. You were talking about some other grapes besides the Chardonnay. What about the Pinot Noir and the kind of clones and all the grapes that we can find there?
Yeah, well, a Pinot Noir is obviously the star grape variety of red Burgundy, although you can still find Gamay planted there. Gamay was actually expelled famously by one of the Dukes of Burgundy, I think it was 1385, who called it a disloyal plant, and it was expelled south because it was more productive than Pinot Noir. So yes, it is a, it's the red grape of Burgundy. It's a thin-skinned grape variety. It's a fragile grape variety. It reflects climate and growing season. It also reflects the intervention of the winemaker, but also the terroir that we've already mentioned. And once you get to know a little bit about the villages, I mean, they do have differences, although it's important not to overgeneralize, because people always say Vosne is this, Volnay is that, Pommard is that. Well, it's important to say who's Vosne, who's Volnay, who's Pommard. Where are we in Vosne? Where are we? For example, where are we in Nuit Saint-Georges? Are we close to the northern end, which is close to Vosne? Are we much closer to the southern end? And the southern end is very different from the northern end. So I think it's important not to overgeneralize about the villages. And some of the villages like Gevrey-Chambertin are very big and cover lots of different styles. Vosne is a bit smaller, Chambol is smaller, particularly small. But once you get to understand the villages a little bit and you filter it through the producer, it's always important to remember that the producer has an influence on style too. You start to appreciate the differences. And Pinot Noir is a wonderful grape variety. It's a frustrating grape variety. Sometimes it makes terrible wines and very overproduced and overpriced wines, from Pinot Noir. But at its best, those wines are sublime, and they are a beautiful combination of place, vintage, terroir, climate, and any particular growing season, and the interpretation that men put on it. So, I mean, it's important not to talk about red Burgundy as one style. It's hundreds of styles, yeah. And the villages help you a little bit. But I would say to anybody watching today who wants to learn about Burgundy is go there and talk to the producers and talk to the négociants and understand a little bit about their interpretation of those different places, because it's very baffling. Sometimes you taste something from, you taste 15 Clos de Vougeot or 15 Échezeaux, and even though they're from the same Grand Cru, they can taste very different.
Yeah, that's one of the best, in my opinion. It's one of the main differences, the producer, because the producer, even if it's the same Grand Cru, can taste totally different. So, in your opinion, which could be the classic red wines from Burgundy, especially in the Côte de Nuit, in comparison with the Côte de Beaune?
I think it depends on what style you like, basically. I mean, that Gevrey-Chambertin is very famous because it has, with Vosne, I think it has slightly one more, I'm trying to remember exactly, Grand Cru. But Vosne and Gevrey would be the two most famous villages, I would say, for red wine production in the Côte de Nuit. But don't forget about Chambol. Chambol is a very delicate style as a general rule, not always, and they tend to be more elegant wines. And if you're a white wine drinker that wants to get into Pinot Noir, you might be better off starting with Chambol than you would with something like a Pommard. I mean, the red wines of the Côte de Beaune, which are obviously further south, tend to be a bit more tannic, whether it be the wines of Corton, the hill of Corton, and those tend to be quite chewy sometimes. Pommard, again, quite chewy and quite dense and deep in color, and often on these thick clay soils. Those tend to be denser wines, the Côte de Beaune wines, as a general rule. But Volnay has a bit of both, depending on how close you are to Pommard. Some of the Volnays are very elegant. You think about Clos des Ducs, which is up the hill, is lovely as a very refined style. So again, it's important not to generalize too much. Again, and Moret is the same thing. Depends how close you are to Chambol or how close you are to Gevrey, really. But all I would encourage people to do is go there when we're allowed to travel again, taste the wines, and actually get into the cellars with people, and then understand a bit more about the wines from tasting them, really.
Usually, when you do a tasting for your guide, how do you start from the beginning to the last bottle? For the age, how do you choose the wines for the commune?
I tend, I mean, this year I haven't been to Burgundy. I've not left England since February because of the pandemic, sadly. I've tasted some of the wines from this vintage in barrel, but normally I'd go to Burgundy for Chablis for 10 days and then to the rest of Burgundy for 3 weeks. And I just go to visit producers, and I probably see between 6 and 8 people a day, usually tasting in their cellars, but sometimes in their offices. And it's a slow process. You know, you're going tasting barrel by barrel by barrel. And, you know, I speak French, so I talk to people in French about their wines. And slowly you build up a picture of a vintage and of people. I mean, the thing about Burgundy is it's a very personal relationship, because you're often tasting in somebody's house, effectively. The domain, a lot of these domains, even top domains, the person who makes the wine is the person who grows the grapes and is the person who receives you when he or she opens the door, really. So I think it's important to remember that about Burgundy. It's a slow process, and it's difficult to get to know Burgundy quickly. That there are no shortcuts. I think Bordeaux is easier because most chateaux make, you know, 2 or 3 wines or 4 wines sometimes, and it doesn't take that long to get up to speed with Bordeaux. Even though Bordeaux is a much bigger wine region than Burgundy, it's probably 3 times the size. It's I would say less complex, although I would get into trouble for saying that with some Bordeaux lovers. But I think Burgundy, because of all these small parcels and because it's so fragmented, is difficult to get to grips with in a way.
And talking about the main regions, because, you know, as Burgundy lovers, we always want to try the big ones, but it's very difficult because they are very expensive. Yeah. So how do you recommend to start getting to the Burgundy wines? I mean, because there are a lot of Premier Cru or even the Village.
Yeah.
How do you recommend to start with the degustation process?
Well, 2 things I would recommend. First of all, is that if you find a top producer, it's often a good idea to buy their bottom wine, right? So if you're, I don't know, if you're buying from a Denis Mortet or Arnaud Mortet, you know, his son of Denis, who's not with us anymore, you know, why not buy a wine that he makes, his Bourgogne Rouge, yeah? So if you're, rather than buy the Grand Cru wines, because they're getting very expensive, I can't afford them anymore, buy a top producer, buy their lesser wines, in inverted commas. That's one way of doing it. The other way is to find producers yourself who are not yet known. And there are lots of ways of doing that, you know, reading people like me and others and things that we recommend. And rather than just saying, I mean, it disappoints me that sometimes people say, oh, you know, everybody when they go to Burgundy wants to go to Domaine de la Romanée-Conti and go to see Christophe Roumier, and they want to go to Le Fleuve and Lafont and, you know, and Dominique Lafont and all these people and Leroy, and they're all people who are obsessed with tasting the top wines, and I don't blame them because they're great. But there are lots of wines made by people who aren't quite as famous that are I would say as good. Yeah, it's just a question of finding them. The other thing I would say, and this comes back to my point about what I was saying about generic wines and village wines, is that with these hotter vintages that we're seeing now, 17, 18, 19, 20, yeah, and Burgundy's only had wet vintages, cool vintages since 2003, really in 2008 and 2013. These hotter vintages means that those lesser sites that I talked about are becoming much better, particularly in the Haute Côte, which has historically been cool and picked very late. Those vineyards are retaining acidity and are good places to buy grapes. So I would say, you know, to people also to trust your own palate, buy with your palate, not what everybody else says is great, right? I mean, the great wines have a reputation because they are great, right? There's no doubt about it, and it's been built up over time. But don't be obsessed with spending thousands of pounds on a bottle of, you know, from Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, not because they're not great, but you could buy 15 bottles or 20 bottles of something that's pretty close to being as good, particularly in these warmer vintages, and save yourself some money. So, you know, that would be the way I would do it.
So, you know, that's why I really like the wines from Chalonnais. I think that Premier Cru from Chalonnais could be a very good option of some producers. What's your opinion about Chardonnay red wine?
I mean, Chardonnay, there's lots of Chardonnay in the world, and almost everybody grows good Chardonnay. And you look nowadays at you know, there's great Chardonnay in Chile, in Argentina, in New Zealand, in Australia, you know, in Spain, in South Africa. Good Chardonnay is grown everywhere. And I think the world has got better at making Chardonnay that tastes like Burgundy or is as good as Burgundy in a lot of places. Therefore, Chardonnay, white wines made from Chardonnay, with the exception of a few Grand Cru, but especially Montrachet, is actually affordable still, whereas Pinot Noir isn't. So I would agree with you. And there used to be, you know, and you can find very good white wines made in the Côte Chalonnaise and in Chablis from Chardonnay, obviously, and in some of the other white wine villages, less well-known white wine villages of the Côte de Beaune. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of somewhere like Santenay or maybe of Saint-Aubin. You know, those are good white wine villages, although Saint-Aubin's now been discovered, where you can find, I agree with you, very good Chardonnay at village level or Premier Cru level, which is as good as most Grand Cru. So I agree with you. I think the gap between the best Burgundy and the best Pinot Noirs of the rest of the world is still significant, although it's closing. But the gap between the best Chardonnays of Burgundy and the best of the rest of the world, to me, no longer exists. I really, you know, I think I've had Chardonnays from New Zealand, from you know, from Argentina, from Australia, from South Africa, which are every bit as good as the best Chardonnays in Burgundy.
Yeah, sure. So we have a question from the audience. Andres Amos is asking, and what's your opinion about Willamette Valley in terms of, I mean, Oregon?
Yeah.
And talking about Pinot Noir.
Yeah, Andres Amos. Hello, Andres. Nice to see you. I can't see.
How are you? Do you remember the friends of Mexican Malbec?
Somos los amigos del Malbec mexicano.
How are you, Jim?
What do I think of Oregon? I like Oregon Pinot Noir very much. I tend to like Oregon Pinot Noir more than I like California Pinot Noir, or most California Pinot Noir. It's further north. You've got some Pacific influence, obviously, some vine age now. I mean, you know, Oregon as a region now goes back to what, the kind of early 80s probably, when David Letts started. I can't remember when Irie Vineyard began, but I think Oregon is very exciting. I mean, it's a really good area. Because it's in America, the prices tend to be expensive. Americans have more money than we do most of the time in England. So the best Oregon Pinot Noirs aren't far off the prices of top Burgundies, really. Maybe not Grand Cru Burgundy, but certainly Premier Cru Burgundies. But I think, yeah, there's some really, really good Oregon Pinot Noirs. I mean, I've not been to Oregon for a while, but whenever I taste stuff from there, you know, I don't know, like Domaine Drouhin, Oregon, or what Kelly Fox makes, you know, I think they're some really, really smart wines. And you know, Irie as well. I think I love the wines that they make. David Adelsheim, you know, some wonderful stuff.
Yeah, here there is another very good question. De Santos said that if you have to pick another region from different part of the world besides Burgundy with the similar characteristic but less expensive, which one would be?
For which grapes? For Pinot Noir and Chardonnay?
I think Pinot Noir.
Yeah, for Pinot Noir, it's difficult because, I mean, Pinot Noir in Burgundy is grown in a continental climate. You know, it's not, there's no influence from the ocean, whereas most of the Pinot Noir grown in other regions of the world tends to be either coastal or much further south in terms of latitude. You know, if you look at somewhere like Patagonia, really, or southern Patagonia. So the area that's most exciting for Pinot Noir, difficult. I mean, there's some fantastic stuff in South Africa, great stuff in New Zealand, great stuff in Australia, in Chile, in Argentina. I mean, you know, I did a big tasting last year of about 50 Pinots from Argentina, and I was amazed by how good some of them were. And I'm very excited by what's happening in Chubut. I think, I mean, my friend Andres is watching today, and he was the person who first introduced me to Chubut. I think that's an exciting area. I think southern Chile, you know, Malleco, and then further south, also pretty exciting. Lots of bits of New Zealand are great. You know, I wouldn't pick one area. The other place I would recommend that is continental would be Germany. We forget that Germany has a lot of Pinot Noir. Germany has more Pinot Noir certainly than New Zealand. So I would say that Germany, if you haven't tasted German Pinot Noirs, they're great. But I'm sorry to say they're often expensive, right? Because again, Germans, like Americans, tend to earn more money than we do as poor people in England. So I can't afford.
Yeah, there are too many options. And for sure, Andres Rosberg, maybe you want to say something about the region that Tim mentioned. I don't know if he's here.
I'm here. Hello. Yes. No, I was muted because my kids are in the background. So if you hear funny noises, that's them. Hi, team. How are you? Good to see you. Hola, Andrés. ¿Qué tal? Hola a todos los amigos por ahí. Yeah, no. Bueno, I can switch to Spanish. Tim hablaba recién de...
Sí, sin problema. Hablamos en español, sí.
Sí, por eso. Tim hablaba recién de Chubut. Chubut es una región muy interesante en el sur de Argentina, al sur de Río Negro, al sur de Neuquén, es como el sur de la Patagonia, en donde no llegamos a tener todavía 100 hectáreas de viñedo. Hay unas 70, 80 hectáreas de menos de 10 productores. Así que algo todavía muy en su inicio, pero una zona realmente muy prometedora, con un clima bastante más frío que el que vemos en el resto de Argentina, porque está al sur y porque está a menor elevación.
Y muchísimo más frío, porque tiene como a veces 10 helados por año, ¿no? Entonces,
y más también, 30 puede tener.
Sí.
En donde el paradigma de elaboración del vino es totalmente diferente. Depende también en qué parte de Chubut, porque dentro de la provincia de Chubut se está haciendo vino en diferentes lugares. Pero estamos hablando de zonas en donde hay 20, 30 heladas por año, donde las heladas se combaten con riego por aspersión, porque en la mayor parte de las zonas vitivinícolas hay agua, a diferencia de Mendoza o Salta.
Sí.
Y en donde, para que se den una idea, Malbec ni se planta porque nadie sueña con producir Malbec, mucho menos Cabernet, es demasiado frío.
Sí.
Y la estrella son los blancos y el Pinot. Pero para que se den una idea, estamos viendo vinos que tienen 10, 10 y medio, 11 grados de alcohol y 12 o 13 gramos de acidez total medida en tartárico. Son parámetros más del norte de Alemania que lo que uno esperaría de Argentina.
Es una región muy prometedora, sí, y todavía, como lo dices muy bien, muy joven, ¿no?
Sí, claro, claro. Y se divide...
Bueno, entre 3 y 10 años. Sí, lo más antiguo sería de 10 años, ¿no?
Sí, lo primero fue... Sí. No, lo primero que se plantó, lo plantó Weinert.
Weinert, sí, sí.
En el hoyo. Sí. Y luego, bueno, Weinert entró en una etapa un poco difícil y no le prestaron tanta atención, pero eso fue lo que disparó que otros productores se animaran a plantar. Y sí, Nancy Fall, familia de Bernardi, Pedro Adamov, Contracorriente y Casa Yagüe son los primeros 5 productores. Ahora se sumó otro proyecto, y este sí es un proyecto grande, que es Otronia.
Sí, Otronia excelente, sobre todo el Chardonnay. Sí.
Que es Otronia, todos los proyectos que les mencionábamos recién en Chubut son de 2 o 3 hectáreas. Otronia es el primer proyecto grande que hay en Chubut, que son 50 o 60 hectáreas, de la familia Bulgeroni, que son los mismos que tienen Garzón en Uruguay y, bueno, Domén Vistalba en Mendoza, ¿verdad? Sí. Así que, bueno, ellos ya han plantado más y tienen otra espalda también para promover el vino de Chubut. Pero todavía estamos viendo las primeras añadas, 2, 3 añadas.
Una región más ventosa, ¿no? Y con más influencia del mar Atlántico.
Bueno, lo que sucede es que dentro de Chubut hay espacios muy, muy diferentes. El caso de Otronia está a menos de 100 kilómetros del mar, en el sur de Chubut, cerca de Comodoro Rivadavia. Hay proyectos como Paso del Sapo en el medio de la estepa, en el medio del desierto, solo que al lado de un río, que es el río Chubut. Y luego están los proyectos que están sobre la cordillera, en donde sí ya llueve mucho, donde no es necesario irrigar, pero que son de perfiles totalmente diferentes.
Ok. Oye, pues
Hablamos de Borgoña hoy, así que los
bien,
dejo a ustedes.
viéndolo bien, tenemos que hacer una sesión, Andrés, sobre las tendencias de Borgoña. Yo no conocía Chubut.
Lo que está pasando en Argentina, porque Andrés sabe mucho de Argentina, de
Totalmente.
los países.
Oye, y estoy impresionado con tu español, Tim. Muchas gracias.
No.
Manuel, gracias, querido Andrés.
No, de
Manuel
nada.
asking, what about the Cesar grape? Have you ever tried? I never tried one wine of this appellation.
César. Yes, I think I have somewhere, but it can't have been very good because I don't remember it. So.
Okay. Okay. That's a pretty good answer and very honest. And you know, when I speak about Burgundy, we can talk about also Beaujolais.
Yeah.
And now there is a trend in many parts of the world, natural wines, different kind of producers, organics. What's your opinion about Beaujolais?
Well, Beaujolais is it's sometimes included within Burgundy, but I think that's wrong because it's made from a different grape. I mean, although you can find Gamay in Burgundy, what I think of as Burgundy, the Beaujolais is very different. It almost belongs to the Northern Rhone, right? I mean, I think that the climate is different, the landscape is different, the architecture is different. It's almost for me where the south of France begins, right? It's made from Gamay, and the best wines are grown on granite soils, just like the Northern Rhone. And you don't find granite in Burgundy, or very little as far as I know, but in tiny amounts. So it's a very different region. In terms of what's interesting about Beaujolais, I think, is a lot of the best producers, or a lot of good producers in Burgundy are now buying vineyards in Beaujolais because the land is so expensive in Burgundy now that even the growers, the families, can't afford to buy them. So if you look at people like I don't know, Thibault Léger-Belair, you look at the Lafarges, you know, they've gone south to Burgundy. And again, you're talking about value for money. Very often, one good way of doing this is to buy Beaujolais made by a top Burgundy producer in the same way that it makes sense to buy wines from the Jura to the east, Pinot Noir, also grown there amongst other things, Trousseau and et cetera, and they're there. I mean, Marquis d'Angeville is making grapes in the Jura, so I think it's important to Beaujolais is increasingly good. It has a bad image because of Beaujolais Nouveau. Beaujolais Nouveau is cheap, and you know it's the classic wine bar wine that was drunk traditionally in Lyon and maybe in Paris, and then spread around the world. But the best Beaujolais, and that tends to come from further south on these sandier soils closer to Lyon. But the best Beaujolais come from these granite soils, which are in the 10 Cru, in the northern part, very close to the Mâconnais, right on the border of the Mâconnais in some cases. And I think that Beaujolais is a very exciting area. In terms of natural wines, well, I mean, I wouldn't say that Beaujolais, I mean, Beaujolais, originally these four producers led by Marcel Lapierre, called the Gang of Four, and they were influenced by a guy who wrote called Jules Chauvet, who was an enologist, and he started encouraging people to make wines without sulfur. So you're right in a way that a big part of the natural wine movement, the modern natural wine movement, came out of Beaujolais. But now I think natural wine spread all over the world. The problem with natural wine is the term doesn't mean anything, you know, and there are good natural wines and bad natural wines. I mean, you know, I think, you know, because you can use sulfur in natural wines, not added sulfur, but sulfur is produced during fermentation as a natural byproduct of fermentation. So therefore, you know, I don't know what a natural wine is. I think if you mean by natural wine that you don't add anything to the wine other than sulfur, which is produced naturally, then I kind of, you know, I think that's interesting. And I think that some natural wines are great. And I think natural wine has broadened the dialogue between wine producers and journalists and wine consumers. And I think also that it's given us a new set of flavors in some ways, particularly orange wines. Orange wines are always natural, but a lot of times they are. But there's a historic tradition of those being produced in Georgia that goes back centuries, you know, with the Quevery system of skin maceration. I think those are really interesting, particularly with white grapes. Sorry, that's another very long answer to your question.
Yes.
I should be drinking wine, really.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, I have another wine here open it's a Clos Bouillon.
Lucky
It
you.
was from yesterday. Yeah. Yeah. So, what about, because we need to talk about producers, sure?
Yeah.
Because otherwise we cannot define the quality of the wines in Burgundy. From north to south, can you give us some names like from Chablis, Côte d'Ivoire, that we can, maybe in some parts of Mexico or Dominican Republic or some countries in America, we can find them?
Well, I suspect that what you see a lot of in Burgundy, in Mexico and Dominican Republic, unless you're a collector, is wines from Negociant. You were showing me a wine there from Louis Latour, who are a good Negociant. If I were looking at Negociant wines, and Negociants either own vineyards all over Burgundy or they buy grapes or wine from all over Burgundy. I mean, my favorite Negociant would be, I think, three. If I chose three, it would be Drouin, José Drouin. It would be Fevlet, whose wines I like very much, and then probably Bichot. You know, I think those are three excellent Negociants. There are lots of much smaller Negociants, what we call micro Negociants. And in fact, these days, even the top domains, if you look at people like Domaine Dujac or I'm trying to think, you know, or Arnaud Mortet, you know, they have a Negociant arm, or I'm trying to think who else, you know, or did the Grivos do it? I can't remember. Anyway, but you know, a lot of the top producers now have a Negociant label almost, and they're almost small Negociants in their own right. So that's one thing I would say. In terms of the top producers, I mean, everybody knows who the top producers in Chambertin, you know, if you were looking at Rousseau or whatever, but again, you probably can't afford to buy Rousseau. If I were in Chambertin, you know, and you were looking for slightly better value for money, you might look at somebody like Pierre Durocher, who is not yet super famous, or possibly, I'm trying to think who else you'd look at there, maybe, well, that's one, isn't it? That's a good one. Going further south into Maurice Saint-Denis, somebody like Topino Melm, you know, I think are a really good producer, and again, not that well known. If you're going into Chambol, well, Chambol is much smaller, and it's harder to find people who aren't pretty well known, but I think Ghislaine Barteau would probably be a really good in there. In Vosne-Romanée, it's difficult really because they're pretty well known, but I would say that Minieret, Gibourg, the Minieret sisters, again, their wines are not super expensive. Nuit Saint-Georges, the Nuit Saint-Georges wines tend to be a little bit cheaper anyway. People like the Lescheneau brothers, I think, are really good. Chevillon, again, these are not super expensive wines. So those would be, you know, if you were in the Côte de Nuit. From the Côte de Beaune, you know, in Volnay, I'd probably go for Voyot. In Pommard, who would I choose in Pommard? Even Contamant is not that expensive, you know. And then once you get into white wine territory, I mean, we could go on all night really. But anyway, I think it's just important to read, I would say, a variety of critics, not just me, but other people who write about Burgundy, and look for new names, yeah? And that's the best way to do it, but make up your own mind. And I would say, don't get hung up on, you know, if I'm in Vosne-Romanée, you know, and I'm not drinking, you know, Ligier Belair, or I'm not drinking, I don't know, or DRC, then there's something wrong with me. You know, there are lots of other producers that you can afford in Beaune and other villages, really.
Yeah, Atkin is asking do you find it paradoxical that in Burgundy, world capital of terroir, we have to pay attention to who the producer is so much?
No, I don't really, because I think for the reasons I explained, you know, the terroir is a given, although it's changing because of climate, and climate is part of the terroir, but the soil doesn't change, and that's definitely true, and the aspect doesn't change. But you know, the point about the human element, if you like, of terroir is I think it's very important. You know, it's one of the three most important things about terroir is what human beings do with the land, how they farm it, whether they use chemicals on the land, whether they're biodynamic, whether they're organic, as you mentioned. Those things are extremely important in Burgundy. And it's their interpretation of the terroir. I think, to go back to what I said earlier, it's possible to have a really good terroir and make bad wine from it. Lots of people do, unfortunately. But you know, so I don't find it paradoxical, although it might appear so in a way. I don't think it is. I think that the best terroir are a given in many respects, although I keep coming back to what I said earlier about, I think climate change is changing perception of which are the best terroir, or certainly will do over the next 10 years. So watch this space. And I think if you're a smart buyer, I'd be thinking now, who's making the best wines in lesser areas, i.e. the haute côte and the lower lying levels, the wetter bits at the bottom of the Côte d'Or, which were considered too wet. But now in these warmer vintages, they retain their clay soils. Very often they retain moisture, and therefore they're more heat resistant and more drought resistant.
Yeah. Well, Pilar is asking about the aging. What's your opinion about the Spätburgunder in Germany in terms of aging?
I think the best one's fantastic. I don't have enough experience of drinking them, I'm afraid to say. But some of the best wines from Baden and the Pfalz and from the Ahr particularly are really good. I mean, I've had 20-year-old Pinots from Germany that have been extremely good. So yeah, I think I'm not an expert on German Pinot Noir at all, but yes, I think that they've got very good aging potential. Certainly as good as most red Burgundy. I mean, I often think with red Burgundy people keep it for too long. Yes, if you have a wine from the 40s or something, you think, oh, it's amazing, or something from the 20s. But it's rare, and I think a lot of Burgundy, even great Burgundy, its drinking window is kind of up to 20 years, and often they taste really good between sort of 8 and 12. Yeah, it depends on the terroir and the vintage, obviously.
Okay. So, what is the next challenge for Team Atkin?
For me, well, to get through the pandemic.
Yeah, survive. Yeah,
I think that survive. Really, I think I'm very much looking forward to traveling again. I really am. In that, my last trip was to Argentina in February of last year, and I, who would have guessed then, as I flew back from Argentina, that I wouldn't be going anywhere, probably until April, May, June of this year. So that's my next challenge is to start traveling again. But I think I'll travel less, to be honest. I think I was traveling a bit too much. And I think one of the things with this year that we've had of pandemia is it's made you think about things. And I think that climate change and our responsibility to the climate and to future generations is one that maybe we don't need to fly around the world as much as we think we do. Just in such the same way as that maybe we don't always need to take our car when we go driving. Maybe we could do something else. Maybe we can switch off electric light bulbs. Maybe we can, just be slightly more responsible about the way that we treat this earth that we're all sharing. And so I think that's maybe something good that will come out of this, is this realization that we've only got one earth and it's in trouble. It really is.
Yeah. So I'm agree with you. So nowadays we need to change our minds and try to do different things, like usually we used to do it in a different way. So like now, in another time, will be very difficult for everybody to be here in the meeting. So,
True. Yeah.
Anyway,
43 people watching. That's great.
Have you been in Mexico, Tim?
I've been to Mexico once, not for wine. I actually went there to go to Mexico City, but also to visit Chichen Itza. I wanted to go and look at the ruins there, basically, which I thought was interesting. And I did a tour through Guatemala and Mexico. I wanted to go and see Tikal as well. And that's the only time I've been to Mexico. But I'd love to go back to Mexico because I didn't know you, but I'm enjoying your company. My friend Andres Amor is there, and I'm very much looking forward to trying more Mexican Malbecs with him because he's the king of Mexican Malbec.
Yeah, I think that you should taste much. We have a lot of brands creating in Mexico. The wine culture is growing a lot of wine enthusiasts, sommeliers, wine lovers. So it's getting famous. Let's do something about it.
I'd love to do something. It'd be great. A little bit. I mean, funnily enough, my father is a writer as well, and my father wrote a book which was a very good best-selling book about the Mexican Revolution.
Yes.
So a little bit of me is feels I have a little bit of my heart, which is in Mexico.
And what about the Mexican gastronomy?
I mean, what I've had of Mexican food, I like very much indeed. I mean, I know that there are some fantastic restaurants in Mexico. I'd like to get to know more, really. I mean, it's just a question of time, really. And maybe we can organize something and go there. I know that I'd also like to go to Peru, to their wonderful food there, and maybe have a look at some old vineyards in Peru. I think would be interesting, in Bolivia. So maybe that would be a good trip. I don't know.
Actually, here in the meeting Zoom is the president of the Colombian Association, the Peruvian Association as well, Juan Pablo. And so I'm pretty sure.
Saludo, amigos.
Anyway, so final question that it's very deep, probably question. I was speaking with Pedro Parra about the soils. So in your opinion, what makes the difference between the soils of Burgundy from other parts of the world?
Well, it's a combination of clay and limestone. I mean, you find limestone in other regions, I have to say. Particularly many of my favorite regions have a lot of limestone. Barolo would be one of them, and Rioja, where I write about, and Ribera, well, Ribera not quite so much, have lots of limestone. And there's way less limestone in places like Chile and Argentina, but it's not unheard of to find it there. So that combination of clay and limestone, but it's as much to do with climate as it is to do with soil type and all the other things we've talked about. And talking to Pedro Parra, he knows a lot about Burgundy. He said he thinks that one of the key elements of terroir in Burgundy historically is cloud cover, i.e. that it's that heat, if you like, and particularly sunlight, is actually filtered through cloud a lot of the time. So you get this very long growing season, or you did. What we're seeing now, unfortunately, is that people are picking in August. And if you look at this vintage that's just passed, I think it was Mayor Camusé who said that in 2003, which is considered a very, very hot vintage in Burgundy, this year they finished picking their last vineyard on the day they started their first vineyard in 2003. So 2020 is way hotter, than 2003 in terms. So there's that big change basically that's happening in Burgundy. So I think I'm not downplaying terroir or soil. All those things are very important. And a lot of terroir is about drainage. And I remember talking to Lalubise Leroy about it, and she said that a lot of what is true about terroir happens so far below the surface. It's not just topsoil, a few meters of topsoil. It's the bedrock and the way the bedrock is shaped and has been shaped by time, really. And it's a lot of stuff you can't actually even see. I mean, I'm sure there are machines that can look at these things and analyze them. But I think a bit of terroir in Burgundy, and I'm not avoiding your question by saying it, is a kind of magic. And to come back to where we started with the monks, there's something, I hate the word mystical almost, but there is something spiritual, there's something emotional, there's something you can't quite explain about the best vineyards. And I think maybe what it is that great wines have been made there in many cases for centuries. Clos de Bez goes back to the 6th century. That's 1400 years. I mean, that's a long time. Well, that's 400 years of making wine in the same place, more. And maybe the people who've been there before leave something of themselves there, whether it's DNA or emotion, or who knows. But I think maybe a big just of Burgundy is something spiritual, something personal, something human, something monastic, maybe, who knows.
Yeah, I was speaking with Pedro, and we just said that probably it's just energy.
I think maybe it is energy, and I think you feel that in places sometimes. You go to places, and and you think this place has got a really good energy, or this place has got a really bad energy. I mean, I remember once going to Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, and it's a very beautiful place. But I thought it had a really bad energy to the place, and it was the center of the slave trade. So it was a lot of sadness had happened in that place. And I think it makes sense that bad energy stays in a place and maybe good energy stays in a place too. So maybe that explains a little bit of what makes Burgundy special and what makes other great wine regions special. It's what happened before us. It's not just about us. It's not just about our time on earth or our generation. It's about what happened 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Even.
Yeah, we don't know many things about wines. We're still learning.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's
and the moment you think you know everything, you know nothing.
Yes, yes. And coming from you that you're a master of wine, it's a huge challenge for me. So, and I need to ask this because I asked some other guys that when we talk about soils, what's your opinion about minerality on the wines?
I think it's, I know what people mean when they say it's minerality, but I think it's a term that's overused. And sometimes people use it just to refer to freshness, to saltiness, to rockiness, could you say? I mean, I think we could maybe broaden our vocabulary a little bit, because minerality becomes something a little bit lazy, that we just say, oh, it's mineral. But what do we mean? You know, is it salty? Is it acidic? Is it bitingly acidic? You know, is it tartaric acid? Is it malic acid? Is it stony? If it's stony, what type of stone is it? Because wines, and Pedro Parra does this a lot, grown on granite soils and schist soils and clay soils and limestone soils, taste very different. But you could argue that they're all mineral in a way. So I think we could almost be a little bit more specific. So I know what people mean. I like mineral wines, but I think maybe it's a slight failure of vocabulary, really.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we just use a word. We can use another word.
So I like stony as a word. I think stony means more than mineral or minerality, but that's only me. Rocky, stony, I don't know.
What's your favorite music, by the way, Tim?
Oh, I like so much different music. If you look on Spotify, my name is Wino61, and there's a list of wines called Music to Drink Wine With, and which I do every week in my newsletter on my website. I put a piece of music up and I talk about the piece of music, and so I like all sorts of things. I mean, I have very diverse taste. I really like jazz a lot. I like classical music. You know, I like rock. I like pop. Honestly, I like so many different types of music. That music is a huge bit of my life. Artists that I really like. I love Keith Jarrett, the jazz pianist, and then from South America, I loved Mercedes Sosa, the great voice of Argentina.
Yeah.
Uruguay, I like Jorge Drexler very much, who I think is great. From Mexico, I don't know as many people actually. I should learn a bit more about Mexican music.
Yeah.
What about
you need to listen to some
Cafe from the República Dominicana. What's it called? Wonderful.
Yeah. Well, so just to finish with this conversation, I would like to put some a song, and you tell me which wine from Burgundy do you pair with.
Okay. What is it?
I don't know why it's not working well. Now the internet is killing me. I don't know why.
This is Sultans of Swing by Dire Straits.
Yes.
It's a very good song, fantastic song with amazing bit of guitar playing. It's quite, you know, it's very poppy. It's got a great beat. It's very musical. It's got great lyrics, I would say. I think I'd go with something fun, really, from Burgundy. So maybe I don't know. Would we go with something like a Gevrey-Chambertin village wine? You know, something from the other side of the road. There's an area called La Justice down there, which is really good. I wouldn't go with something too serious. I don't think it's a profound song, but I think it's a fun song. Yeah. That would be good.
For sure. And listen this. This is a Mexican.
This is Carlos Santana.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Samba para ti.
Great guitarist.
Yeah, it's another style, but what do you match with this what kind of wine from Burgundy?
Oh, I think that would be hard. This is a much more meditative piece of music with amazing guitarist. What would I choose with that? I think I'd go with something a little bit more profound. I might go with something like a Musigny or something like that. I can imagine myself sitting and listening to that music with a big Burgundy glass and just swirling the wine around and smelling it.
Okay, got it. Well, my friend, it's been a pleasure to talk with you during this hour.
So long to get me to do it.
Yes, I don't want to spend more of your time. You are a very busy guy, and you have some other appointments. But let's give me the names of the recent guys that you wrote. Maybe some people want to read them.
The best thing to do is to look at my website, which is timatkin.com. And you can subscribe to my newsletter. It's completely free, or my reports are on there, and there's an article up every week and tasting notes. So have a look at the website.
All right, perfect. Because
my surname is Atkin, not Atkins. Atkin.
Yeah, Atkin. Yeah, I read. I read something about the South African wines and wines from some other parts of the world, like Rioja. I was very surprised, actually, when you did the classification of the Riojas.
Yes.
I was with some friends and some of them were not really happy. But it's okay.
But that's the job of a journalist, is to say something that makes some people happy, and you've got to be opinionated, right?
Yeah. So, my friend, thank you very much for your time.
See you, Andres and everybody else who's watching. Nice to see you.
Yeah, and let's try to still learning about the wines and create something different in this world.
Okay. Un abrazo a todos. Gracias por estar.
Un abrazo y que Dios te bendiga.
Espero que nos veamos en México un día.
Te voy a invitar para llevarte a las pirámides de Teotihuacán y a probar vino.
Excelente. Vamos juntos. Con una buena copa de vino mexicano.
Sí, exacto.
Ojalá.
Bueno.
Okay.
Hasta la vista.
Ya, amigos.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todos los que estuvieron en esta masterclass. Espero que haya sido muy contributivo para ustedes. Toda esta información que compartió Tim con nosotros sobre las apelaciones, suelos, productores. La verdad es que es un tema bastante interesante y se podrían hacer muchas masterclasses.